The orphan boy had nothing, except a single piece of bread. But when he saw the starving fox collapse in the snow, trembling, watching him, he did something that would change everything. He had spent the last 3 days searching for food. Nothing but frozen earth, ice-cold wind, and hunger clawing at his stomach. His clothes were thin, barely enough to keep the frost from biting his skin. The town had turned him away, the baker had chased him with a stick, and the last thing he had eaten was a few frozen berries. Days ago. Now all he had was this small, half-stale piece of bread, and he was not sure if he would get another. But then he saw the fox. It lay there, half buried in the snow. A dying thing. Its ribs pushed against its thin skin, its fur, once beautiful and bright, was patchy and dull. Its golden eyes, pleading, desperate, locked onto him. The boy's chest tightened. He was starving too. He had stolen this bread just to survive another night. But the fox would not last that long. The wind howled through the barren trees, whispering through the silence of the empty forest. The cold pressed in. Snowflakes drifted down, landing on the fox's thin coat, melting into nothing. His fingers trembled as he broke the bread in half. His mind screamed at him. This was all he had. But as he looked into the fox's fading eyes, he could not turn away. Slowly he reached forward, offering the small piece of bread. The fox shivered, hesitated. Then, with a weak, desperate movement, it inched forward. Its black nose twitched, and before the boy could blink, the fox snapped up the bread and collapsed. The boy's heart pounded. Was it too weak? Was he too late? He moved closer, reaching out. The fox did not flinch. It just lay there, breathing raggedly. The boy swallowed hard. He had to do something. He pulled off his tattered scarf and, as gently as he could, wrapped the trembling creature in the fabric. It barely reacted. He could feel its fragile heartbeat beneath his fingertips, weak, but still fighting. As he cradled the fox against his chest, something inside him shifted. He had saved it, or at least he thought he had. He had no idea that from this moment on, the fox would never leave his side. The boy hesitated, his fingers trembling as he extended the small piece of bread. The fox did not lunge. It did not snarl. It just stared. Golden eyes, deep and unreadable, locked onto his own. There was no desperation in them, no wild hunger, just something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the skeletal branches overhead. Snow swirled in the air, stinging his face, but he barely noticed. He could not look away. The fox did not move, did not twitch, did not blink. Why was it just standing there? Starving animals did not hesitate. They fought, they stole. But this fox, it was waiting. His breath clouded in front of him, merging with the thick silence stretching between them. His grip on the bread tightened. Was it afraid? No. Its body was weak, trembling slightly, but it did not look scared. It looked calm. Slowly, cautiously, the boy lowered himself into a crouch. His boots crunched softly in the snow. The fox's ears twitched, but it did not back away. Closer now, he could see the full extent of its condition. Ribs jutted sharply from beneath its dull, matted fur. Its legs were too thin, barely holding its frail body upright. Frost clung to its whiskers, and the tip of its tail looked frozen stiff. It was starving, but it was not desperate. The boy's chest tightened. He had seen hunger before, lived it, felt it gnaw at his insides until it became part of him. He knew what it did to people, to animals. Hunger made them reckless, rabid. But this fox was neither. Why? Swallowing hard, he extended the bread lower, almost to the ground. And then the fox moved, not in a frantic, starving rush, but silently, deliberately, took one slow step forward, then another. His paws barely made a sound in the fresh snow. His gaze never wavered, never left his. The boy held his breath. The fox was close now, close enough that he could see its nostrils flare, scenting the air. close enough to see the thin layer of ice crusting its fur. And then, in one smooth motion, it lowered its head and took the bread from his hand. A sharp breath escaped the boy's lips. His fingers tingled where its whiskers had brushed against his skin. Cold. So cold. The fox chewed slowly, carefully, like it was savoring the taste, like it was thinking. The boy swallowed, his throat dry. His heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that he swore the fox could hear it. Then, with one last glance at him, the fox turned and walked away. Not hurried, not afraid, just gone. The boy exhaled, his breath shaking. The cold pressed against his skin, but he barely felt it. He stared at the spot where the fox had been, the snow disturbed only by its faint, delicate footprints. What just happened? It was just a fox, just an animal. So why did it feel like something had just changed? He pushed himself up, brushing the snow off his knees. The light was fading fast. He needed to get back to the cabin before dark. The storm was closing in, and if he got caught in it, a sound, a soft, barely there crunch in the snow behind him. The boy froze. He was being followed. His heart pounded as he turned, eyes darting to the trees. There, half hidden in the darkness, was the fox. It was watching him. Golden eyes gleamed through the shadows, locked onto him with eerie stillness. It had not run. It had not left. Why? A shiver ran down his spine. Not from the cold. From something else. Something deeper. He swallowed hard. He should leave. Should walk away. But somehow, he could not. The boy's breath came shallow as he stood frozen, staring back at the fox. It was still there, still watching. The storm winds howled through the trees, rattling the bare branches overhead. Snow swirled in the air, but the fox did not flinch. Why was it following him? His hands curled into fists at his sides, his fingers numb from the cold. He should just keep walking. Ignore it. Animals did not do this, but his feet would not move. Something about those eyes. They did not hold the wild, untamed gleam of a normal fox. They were too steady, too certain. A gust of wind kicked up a flurry of snow between them, and for a split second, the fox disappeared. His heart jumped. Then a shadow moved. Not in the trees. Not in the snow. Closer. His pulse pounded as he took a slow step back. The fox followed. Not hurried. Not hunting. Just mirroring him. His throat tightened. This was not normal. Animals ran, fled, hid. But this fox, it was not acting like an animal. He clenched his jaw. Fine. If it wanted to follow him, let it. He turned sharply and started walking. Crunch. He stopped. So did the fox. The cold wind whistled through the empty woods. His breath fogged the air. Slowly, he took another step forward. Crunch. Another. Crunch. His pulse hammered. It was matching his pace. He spun around, the fox stopped. Snowflakes clung to its fur. His golden eyes did not waver. The boy swallowed hard. He was being followed. No, watched. The wind howled, biting through his thin coat. He had to get back. The cabin was not far. He just had to move. Turning again, he walked faster. His boots crunched against the ice, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He did not check behind him, did not look, did not need to. He could feel it. The presence. The silent, unwavering watching. Snow pelted against his face as the storm grew stronger. His cabin's dark outline emerged through the thick white haze ahead. His chest eased, he was almost there. He reached the door, his fingers stiff as he fumbled with the latch. The old wood groaned as he shoved it open, the warmth inside hitting him like a wall. He stepped in fast, slamming the door shut behind him. His breath came fast and heavy. Safe. The howling wind rattled the walls. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickering shadows dancing across the wooden walls. He exhaled slowly, pressing his back against the door. Then, a soft sound, barely there, just beyond the door. His heart stopped. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head. Through the frost-lined window, the fox was there, sitting in the snow, staring straight at him. His chest tightened. His fingers dug into the wood behind him. The wind howled louder, but IT did not move. Just sat there, watching, waiting. The boy's throat went dry. It had followed him all the way home, and it was not leaving. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears. His fingers gripped the wooden door behind him, his nails pressing into the grain. He wanted to move, to breathe, to look away, but he could not. The fox was still there. Its golden eyes burned through the glass, its body motionless against the storm. Snowflakes clung to its thin fur, but it did not shiver, did not blink, did not leave. A sharp gust of wind rattled the cabin walls, making the wooden beams creak. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth licking at his back. Still, the cold dug into his chest. The boy's throat felt tight. He should turn away, ignore it. Animals did strange things sometimes. Maybe it was just curiosity. But then, the fox moved. Not much, just a tilt of its head. Slight, slow, intentional, like it understood. The boy's breath caught. His muscles locked. The room felt too small. His hands curled into fists trying to ground himself. He had felt this before. That night, the night his father left. The same tension, the same waiting. Back then, he had watched his father stand by the door, his back stiff, his face hard to read. He had waited for him to speak, to turn around, to say something, but he never did. Just like now, the fox just watched. A deep ache swelled in his chest. Why would it not go? The wind outside howled, making the shutters bang against the wooden walls. The storm was getting worse. It should be looking for shelter. Instead, it sat in the open snow. The boy licked his cracked lips. He should just blow out the lamp. Walk away. Let the darkness swallow it. But that nagging pull in his chest would not leave. A whispering voice in the back of his mind. What if it does not survive? His stomach twisted. It was starving. He had seen the way its ribs pressed through its thin fur, the way it hesitated before eating the bread he had left. It should be dead already, and yet it had followed him. All the way here, the boy clenched his jaw. No, he could not. Taking in a sharp breath, he forced himself to move. His legs felt heavy as he turned away from the window, stepping toward the fire. He reached for the iron pot hanging over the flames. The stew had gone cold. He had been too distracted. He sighed, rubbing at his temple. It was not his problem. Turning away, he grabbed a small chunk of bread from the table and shoved it into his mouth, trying to push down the knot in his throat. Then a sound, so soft, barely audible over the wind. A whine. The boy froze. His fingers tightened around the wooden table. It had come from outside. His pulse hammered. The fox had not made a sound all night. Until now. Slowly, as if something else controlled his body, he turned back. Through the frost-lined window, the fox was still there. But it was not staring at him anymore. His golden eyes were lowered. Its ears, once so alert, now drooped. And then, it moved. His body swayed. The boy's breath caught. The fox took a step forward, then collapsed. His heart stopped. Snow dusted its unmoving frame, its ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His paws twitched slightly, but it did not get up. The boy stared. His chest tightened. The wind howled outside, swallowing everything in its cold embrace. The fox was dying, and if he did nothing, it would not see the morning. The boy's breath frosted in the icy air as he shoved open the door. The wind howled, blasting against his small frame, biting through his worn coat. Snow swirled in blinding waves, but his eyes were locked on one thing. The fox. It lay motionless, half buried in the thick snow. His chest tightened. His boots crunched through the frozen ground as he stumbled forward. He should not be doing this. He knew better, but his body moved on its own. Kneeling beside the fox, he hesitated. His ribs rose, fell, too slow. His fur was stiff with ice. It was still alive, but not for much longer. He needed to decide. Now, his hands trembled as he reached forward, his fingers brushing the cold, matted fur. The fox did not stir. For a split second he saw himself, a small boy, trembling in the dark, hunger gnawing at his insides, his fingers numb, his breath ragged, waiting for someone, anyone, to care. But no one ever came. His throat tightened. His fingers gripped the fox's fragile body. Then he lifted it. The wind screamed around him as he struggled back toward the cabin, his boots slipping, his muscles burning. The fox did not move. He reached the door, shoved it open, and stumbled inside. The warmth of the fire engulfed him instantly, but his focus was on the frail creature in his arms. Kneeling down, he placed the fox on the worn rug by the hearth. Snowflakes melted into the fabric, pooling around its thin frame. His breath shuddered. Had he been too late? For a long moment the fox lay still, too still. Then a twitch, a slight, shaky breath. It was alive. Relief crashed through him. Quickly, he grabbed an old wool blanket, draping it over the fox. Then, without thinking, he reached for the iron pot hanging over the fire, scooping out a small portion of the warm stew. He set the bowl near its nose, waited. Seconds stretched. Then a shift. The fox's nose twitched. A moment later, weak, trembling paws pushed against the floor. The golden eyes blinked open. The boy froze, their gazes locked. Something passed between them, a silent understanding. Slowly, weakly, the fox leaned forward. The boy released a breath he did not know he had been holding. His fingers curled against his chest, an unfamiliar warmth settling inside him. He did not know why, but in that moment, he was no longer alone. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. The boy sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, watching the fox. It had finished eating only a few small bites, but enough to prove it wanted to live. Now it lay curled beneath the old wool blanket, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The ice had melted from its fur, revealing a rich, reddish coat, though it still looked painfully thin. The boy sighed, leaning his head back against the wooden wall. What now? The fox was here in his home. It was alive. But what came next? Would it leave? Would it stay? Would it even remember this? His fingers absent-mindedly traced a faded tear in his coat. He had never had anything stay. Not his parents. Not the kind-faced woman who had taken him in for a short while. Not even the stray dog he had once tried to feed. The moment you let yourself care, life found a way to take things away. His chest tightened. Maybe it was better to let the fox rest, recover, and then go. But deep down, a part of him whispered, "Do you want that?" The fox stirred. His breath caught. Golden eyes flickered open, hazy but aware. It blinked, ears twitching slightly, before slowly lifting its head. The boy did not move. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, the fox shifted. Weak, trembling paws pushed against the blanket as it struggled to sit up. The boy instinctively reached out, stopped. Would it run? Would it fear him? The fox hesitated, then did something that made his breath halt. It leaned toward him, not away, not in fear, toward him. A slow, uncertain movement, but it meant everything. His fingers twitched. Cautiously, as if the moment might break, he lifted his hand, inch by inch, until it hovered just above the fox's damp fur. A pause. A single moment of hesitation. Then, he gently laid his hand on the fox's head. Warm, soft, alive. The fox did not flinch, did not pull away. Instead, it closed its eyes. A quiet exhale left the boy's lips. He had touched wild animals before, brief, fleeting moments when desperation overpowered fear. A bird with a broken wing, a rabbit caught in a snare. But this felt different. More. The fire flickered, warm and steady. Outside, the wind still howled. But inside, in this small, lonely cabin, something had changed. He was not sure what. Not yet. But as he sat there, fingers still resting gently against soft fur, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a boy, and this was no longer just a fox. The morning came slowly. A pale light seeped through the cracks in the wooden shutters, painting faint patterns across the floor. The wind had died down, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. The boy blinked, sleep clinging to the edges of his mind. His back ached from leaning against the wall all night, but he had not dared to move. Not while the fox was still there. It had stayed, curled beneath the blanket, its chest rising and falling in soft, steady breaths. Warm, alive, safe. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a mixture of relief and unease. Was it too weak to leave? Or did it not want to? Slowly, carefully, the boy shifted. His body protested, stiff and sore, but he ignored it. Instead, his eyes locked onto the fox. It did not stir. For a moment he just watched. The way its ears flicked slightly, the way its nose twitched in its sleep. It did not look so different from a stray dog now, except for those eyes. Even in rest, even in warmth, they held something deeply wild. Unbroken. A knot formed in his stomach. What happens now? He had never kept anything before. Never had the chance to. Would it even let him? His breath slowed. He reached out, fingers hovering just above the fox's fur. A sudden shift. The fox's body tensed. Eyes snapping open. A sharp intake of breath. The boy froze. Golden eyes met his, wide and alert. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then a flinch. The fox pulled back. Not violently, not in fear, but cautiously. It had woken up in a strange place, next to a stranger. Of course it would pull away. The boy swallowed, ignoring the tightness in his chest. He slowly drew his hand back, resting it on his knee instead. A quiet moment stretched between them. Then, the fox did something unexpected. It did not run. It did not snarl. It simply stared, long unblinking, as if studying him, judging him, and then slowly it moved. Not away, not out the door, but closer. A small shift, barely noticeable, but the message was clear. It was not leaving. The boy let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Something deep inside him, something he had buried for a long, long time, unraveled. He was not alone anymore. At least, not for now. The boy did not dare to move. The fox was still watching him, golden eyes locked onto his every breath. Not with fear, not with hostility, but with something unreadable. A test. His chest felt tight. What did it want? Would it stay if he reached for it again? Would it run if he moved too fast? His fingers curled into the fabric of his tattered sleeve, hesitating. Then a growl. Low, quiet, not a threat, a warning. The fox's ears flicked back slightly, its body still as stone. The boy exhaled slowly. He understood. It was not asking for affection. It was asking for respect. He nodded, just a slight dip of his chin. The fox did not move. Not away, not closer. The moment stretched between them, fragile as a thread in the wind. Then a shift. The fox's gaze softened. Its ears twitched forward again. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but to the boy, it meant everything. His pulse pounded against his ribs as he sat there, muscles locked in place, waiting for the fox to decide. Then finally, it moved. A slow, deliberate movement. Not away, not out the door, toward him. The fox settled its body just beside his knee. Close, not touching, but close. The breath left his lungs in a quiet rush. This was trust, not something given, something earned. His throat felt tight as he watched it. The fox had chosen to stay, for now. And deep in his chest, where the cold had lived for so long, something warm began to stir. The night stretched long and endless. The wind howled against the rotting walls of the shack, slipping through every crack like a ghostly whisper. The boy curled deeper into his thin blanket, his body tight with cold, his breath shallow. But he was not alone. The fox still lay near his knee, its body curled in a tight circle, its tail wrapped around itself. Its ears twitched every so often, listening, but it did not move away. The boy should have been asleep, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the fox in the dim glow of the dying fire. His chest felt strange, tight in a way he could not name. He had never named anything before. No one had ever named him. His fingers twitched against the blanket, hesitation gripping him. Would the fox stay if he spoke, or would it disappear like everything else? He swallowed hard. Then, so softly it barely left his lips, "Ember." The word hovered in the air, fragile as frost. The fox's ear flicked. The boy held his breath. The silence stretched. Then, the fox shifted, not away, toward him. A slow, deliberate movement closer. The boy's throat burned. His fingers curled against his chest. It hurt him, and it did not leave. His heart trembled. For the first time in his life, he had something to call his own. And as sleep finally pulled at his exhausted limbs, he breathed one last whisper into the darkness. "Ember." And this time it felt like a promise. The wind had settled into a soft, distant whisper, but the cold remained, thin and sharp as a blade. The boy slept, but the fox did not. Its golden eyes flickered open in the darkness, reflecting the faintest glimmer of dying embers. It had heard the boy's voice. It had felt something in the way he spoke that name. Ember. A name was not just a word. A name was a chain, a tether to something more than the body, something deeper. It stared at the boy, its gaze unreadable, its body still. Outside, the world was listening. The trees stood in silence. The river lay frozen, unmoving. Even the stars seemed to flicker less brightly. Something had shifted. Something new. He knew. The fox's ears twitched. It lifted its head slightly, its breath curling into the cold air. Far in the distance, beyond the trees, beyond the ice, a sound. So faint, so far, it could have been mistaken for the wind. But the fox knew better. They were not alone. For the first time since it had stepped into this boy's life, the fox felt the weight of something watching back. It slowly lowered its head again, its tail curling closer around its body. Not in fear, but in readiness. The boy had given it a name. And now, something had taken notice. The boy stirred. A faint prickle ran along his skin, an instinctive shiver. Not from the cold, but from something else. His breath hitched, his eyelids fluttering as he drifted between sleep and waking. The air in the shack felt different, thicker. He was not sure why, but his chest felt tight, his heart picking up speed. His fingers twitched under the thin blanket, grasping at nothing. The embers in the fire had burned down to weak, pulsing coals. Shadows stretched long across the wooden walls, breathing with the dim light. Then he heard it, a sound outside. His body stiffened. His breath turned silent. At first, it was almost too soft to notice. A shift, like something brushing against the snow. Then another, a second step. Then a third. Something was moving. The boy's heart pounded in his throat. His first instinct was to hide, to curl up, make himself small, pretend he was not there. But then he felt something against his knee. Warm, steady, ember. The fox was pressed against him, its fur brushing his leg. But it was not curled in sleep anymore. It was staring at the door, listening. The boy swallowed, his throat dry, his fingers clenching the blanket so hard his knuckles ached. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the entrance of the shack. The door was nothing but old wood, weak at the hinges, the gaps between the planks letting in thin slivers of the outside. The wind had died down, but something was there. A shadow moved, just beyond the entrance. Not the shape of a tree, not the flutter of snow. Something tall, still, waiting. The boy's breath shook. The fox's tail flicked, just slightly. Then, a single sound. Not the wind, not the trees, not an animal. A whisper, So low, so distant, yet somehow close. A voice he did not recognize. Speaking his name. The boy could not breathe. His body was locked in place, his muscles frozen with something deeper than fear. He had heard his name before, but never like this. Not from something unseen. Not from something that did not belong to the world he knew. His fingers clenched the thin blanket, his breath slow, shallow, his chest barely rising. The fox remained still, its ears pointed, its tail curled, but its body was tense. It was not just watching the door. It was waiting. Then, a shadow shifted. A long, dark shape moved past the thin slats of wood. It did not make a sound now, but the boy knew. It was still there, watching, listening, waiting for him. Something cold settled in his stomach, twisting tight. He did not know how, but deep inside he felt it. If he moved, if he made a sound, it would come. His hands shook. His breath stilled. He wanted to close his eyes, to pretend he had imagined it, to push himself deeper into the corner of the shack and disappear. But then, the fox moved. Not away. Toward the door. The boy's heart nearly stopped. Ember, no. But the fox did not hesitate. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its head lowering slightly, its gaze locked on the entrance. Then it made a sound. A low, quiet growl. Not loud, not aggressive, just a warning. The boy's breath hitched. His fingers twitched. The sound that had terrified him moments ago, the one outside, the whisper in the dark, did not return. Instead, the shadow moved away. Not fast, not frightened, just withdrawing. The boy did not move, his body still rigid, his skin crawling with cold sweat. He listened, waiting, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. But the steps did not return. The whisper did not come again. The wind pushed softly through the cracks, filling the silence where something else had been. But now, it was gone. His muscles ached from being so tense, his fingers stiff from gripping the blanket too hard. But he did not care. He exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath, his chest trembling. The fox turned back to him, its amber eyes calm, unshaken. It did not speak. It did not need to. The boy swallowed, his throat dry, his body finally releasing. He had never had anyone stand beside him before. But tonight, as the last embers of the fire faded into the dark, he was not alone. Morning came softly. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the boy felt it. Not just the cold, not just the ache of hunger, but the warmth of something new. Ember still lay beside him, curled in a tight ball, its fur brushing against his arm. The fire had burned down to nothing but smoking embers, but somehow, the night had not felt as empty. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Outside, the world was changing. The forest no longer seemed so dark. The snow, once endless and cruel, now glowed under the pale gold of morning light. Ember stirred, its ears flicking at the movement. Then, without hesitation, the fox rose to its feet and padded to the door. It stopped at the threshold, glancing back. Waiting. The boy swallowed. For so long, the world outside had been nothing but a place to survive. A place full of things that took and took until there was nothing left. But now, his fingers curled. For the first time, he wanted to step forward. Not because he had to, not because he was running, but because he was not alone anymore. He pushed himself up, his legs unsteady but firm. And then, as Ember turned and slipped into the snow, he followed. His feet left the safety of the shack, stepping into the glowing light. The world was still vast, still unknown. But this time it did not feel so empty, because something had changed. He had changed. And as they vanished into the forest, boy and fox, side by side, the only thing left behind was the whisper of footprints in the snow, and the faint glow of morning rising behind them.